The story of the Ottoman Empire begins not in marble palaces or vast cities, but on a violent and uncertain frontier. At the end of the 13th century, the Middle East and Anatolia were lands shaped by collapse. The once powerful Seljuk Sultanate of Rum had been shattered by Mongol invasions. Central authority had broken down. What remained was a patchwork of small Turkish principalities, known as beyliks, scattered across western Anatolia. These frontier states lived by war. Their survival depended on raids, alliances, and the constant taking of land. To the west stood the weakening Byzantine Empire. Once the ruler of the eastern Mediterranean, Byzantium had been reduced to scattered territories, drained by civil wars, economic decline, and foreign invasions. Its borderlands were thinly defended. Fortresses stood isolated. Villages were vulnerable. This border between the Christian Byzantine world and the Muslim Turkish frontier became a permanent battlefield. From this environment emerged a new kind of warrior society. These fighters called themselves ghazis. They believed they were engaged in holy struggle, but they were also practical men seeking land, wealth, and prestige. Warfare was not an occasional event. It was a way of life. Victory meant survival. Defeat meant disappearance. Among the many frontier leaders was a minor chieftain named Osman I. He ruled a small territory near the Byzantine border around the year 1299. By any measure, Osman was insignificant compared to older and richer rivals. Yet his position was strategic. His land sat directly beside weakened Byzantine towns, offering endless opportunities for expansion. Osman's power did not come from wealth or noble lineage. It came from loyalty and warfare. He attracted warriors by offering them land taken from enemies. Each successful raid brought new followers. Each conquest expanded his authority. In time, his small band of fighters became a permanent military community. Osman's forces did not fight large, organized wars in the early years. Instead, they relied on fast raids, ambushes, and sieges of poorly defended towns. Byzantine strongholds fell one by one. The local Christian population was not always expelled. Many remained, paying taxes and adapting to new rulers. This flexible approach helped stabilize conquered lands and reduced resistance. As Osman's territory grew, so did his ambition. He began to act not just as a tribal leader, but as a ruler. Coins were minted in his name. Friday sermons mentioned him as sovereign. These acts marked a quiet but decisive break from the Seljuk past. A new state was being born. After Osman's death around 1324, leadership passed to his son Orhan. Under Orhan, warfare became more organized and more permanent. The Ottomans captured the city of Bursa in 1326, turning it into their first capital. This was a crucial moment. The Ottomans were no longer just raiders. They were builders of cities, administrators of land, and managers of armies. Orhan introduced standing military units paid by the state. Infantry soldiers, recruited and trained for regular service, began to replace temporary tribal fighters. This shift allowed the Ottomans to wage longer campaigns and hold territory more effectively than their rivals. At the same time, the Ottomans crossed into Europe for the first time. In 1354, an earthquake damaged the Byzantine fortress of Gallipoli. Ottoman forces moved in almost immediately. This crossing into the Balkans changed everything. From this moment on, Ottoman warfare would be fought on two continents. The Balkans were divided and politically unstable. Local rulers often fought each other as much as they resisted Ottoman expansion. The Ottomans exploited these divisions. Some Balkan lords became vassals. Others were defeated in battle. Ottoman armies advanced steadily, using speed, discipline, and careful diplomacy. Under Murad I, warfare intensified. Murad turned the Ottoman state into a true empire in the making. He established the Janissaries, an elite infantry force trained for absolute loyalty to the ruler. These soldiers would become the backbone of Ottoman military power for centuries. The defining battle of this early period came in 1389 at Kosovo. Ottoman forces faced a coalition of Balkan armies. The fighting was brutal and costly on both sides. Murad himself was killed during the battle. Yet the Ottomans emerged victorious. Kosovo marked the collapse of organized resistance in much of the Balkans and confirmed the Ottomans as a dominant regional power. By the end of the 14th century, the Ottomans controlled vast territories in Anatolia and southeastern Europe. Their rise had been rapid, but it was far from secure. Powerful enemies remained. To the east, a new and far greater threat was forming, one that would test whether the Ottoman state could survive its first great disaster. The age of Ottoman warfare had begun, but its future was still uncertain. By the beginning of the 15th century, the Ottoman state had moved beyond its fragile origins. Warfare was no longer just a tool for survival. It had become the engine of expansion, shaping institutions, society, and identity. After the death of Murad I at Kosovo, leadership passed to his son Bayezid I, a ruler whose reign would be defined by speed, aggression, and relentless campaigning. Bayezid earned the name, the Thunderbolt, because of how quickly his armies moved. He understood that hesitation was dangerous. Every pause gave enemies time to unite. Bayezid focused first on consolidating Ottoman control in the Balkans. Serbian and Bulgarian territories were brought firmly under Ottoman authority. Local rulers were either replaced or turned into vassals, forced to provide troops and tribute. Ottoman warfare was now systematic. Campaigns were planned seasonally. Supply routes were secured. Fortresses were isolated and reduced one by one. At the same time, Bayezid turned eastward. Anatolia was still divided among Turkish beyliks, many of whom resented Ottoman expansion. Through a mix of warfare and diplomacy, Bayezid absorbed rival states, bringing much of western and central Anatolia under Ottoman control. This expansion created a continuous Ottoman territory stretching from the Danube to the heart of Anatolia. The growing power of the Ottomans alarmed Europe. In response, a massive crusading army was assembled, led by Hungarian and French nobles. Their goal was to stop Ottoman expansion once and for all. The two forces met in 1396 at the Battle of Nicopolis. Nicopolis was one of the largest battles of the medieval era. The Crusader army, confident and heavily armored, launched a reckless assault. Ottoman forces absorbed the attack, then countered with disciplined infantry and cavalry. The result was a catastrophic defeat for the Crusaders. Thousands were killed or captured. European resistance collapsed almost overnight. Nicopolis confirmed the Ottomans as a major military power. No longer seen as a frontier threat, they were now recognized as a permanent force in European politics. Yet victory carried a hidden danger. Bayezid's rapid expansion had overextended the state. Enemies were watching closely. One of them was a conqueror whose reputation dwarfed even Bayezid's. To the east, Timur had built an empire through destruction and terror. His armies had crushed Persia, Central Asia, and parts of India. Timur saw the rising Ottomans as rivals, and Bayezid's annexation of Anatolian beyliks gave him the excuse he needed. In 1402, the two empires collided at the Battle of Ankara. Bayezid's army marched east, confident in its experience and numbers. But the Ottomans faced unfamiliar tactics. Timur's forces used mobility, deception, and psychological warfare. Worse still, some Anatolian troops defected mid-battle, turning against Bayezid. The Ottoman army collapsed. Bayezid was captured, a humiliation without precedent. He died in captivity the following year. The defeat at Ankara shattered Ottoman authority overnight. Territories were lost. Vassals rebelled. The empire entered a period of chaos known as the interregnum. For more than a decade, Bayezid's sons fought each other in civil war. Each claimed legitimacy. Each raised armies. The Ottomans, once feared, were now divided and vulnerable. European states regained lost lands. Anatolian beyliks re-emerged. It appeared that the Ottoman experiment might end as quickly as it had begun. Yet even in collapse, the foundations of Ottoman warfare endured. Administrative systems survived. Military traditions remained intact. When order was finally restored under Mehmed I in 1413, the state was wounded but not destroyed. The Ottomans had faced annihilation and survived. That survival would shape their future approach to war. Expansion would continue, but now with greater caution, stronger institutions, and a deeper understanding that power could be lost as quickly as it was gained. The next phase of Ottoman warfare would be driven not just by conquest, but by recovery, adaptation, and a determination never to fall so close to extinction again. The years following the disaster at Ankara were the most dangerous in Ottoman history. The defeat had not merely broken an army. It had shattered authority itself. Without a single ruler, the Ottoman state fractured into rival camps, each claiming legitimacy through blood, force, or survival. Bayezid's sons divided the empire among themselves. Each controlled different territories and raised armies in his own name. Warfare returned to the Ottoman lands, not against foreign enemies, but among brothers. Cities changed hands repeatedly. Alliances shifted without warning. Loyalty was temporary, and betrayal was common. European powers moved quickly to exploit the chaos. Byzantium regained lost lands and played Ottoman princes against each other. Balkan vassals declared independence. Anatolian beyliks reclaimed territory once absorbed by Bayezid. The empire that had once seemed unstoppable now appeared to be dissolving. Yet something remarkable happened during this collapse. Even as rival princes fought, the core systems of Ottoman rule endured. Provincial administration continued. Tax collection resumed where possible. Military units, though divided, remained organized and disciplined. The idea of the Ottoman state did not disappear, even when leadership was contested. Out of this chaos emerged Mehmed I. He was not the strongest of Bayezid's sons at first, nor the most ambitious. But he was patient. He fought carefully, avoided unnecessary destruction, and focused on rebuilding authority rather than ruling through fear. By 1413, Mehmed had defeated or outmaneuvered his rivals. He reunited the empire and restored central control. His reign marked a shift in Ottoman warfare. Expansion slowed. Consolidation took priority. Fortresses were repaired. The army was reorganized. Loyalty was rewarded, and rebellion was punished swiftly. Mehmed understood that survival required restraint. The Ottomans had expanded too quickly under Bayezid, ignoring the limits of logistics and political stability. Now, warfare would be planned with long-term control in mind. Victories were meaningless if they could not be held. When Mehmed died in 1421, his son Murad II inherited a far more stable state. But stability did not mean peace. Almost immediately, the empire was drawn back into war. Byzantium attempted to manipulate succession disputes. Balkan rulers tested Ottoman strength. Anatolian rivals sensed opportunity. Murad II responded with decisive force. He crushed revolts, subdued rebellious vassals, and reasserted Ottoman dominance across the Balkans. Warfare once again became the tool of authority, but now it was backed by stronger administration and a more professional military. The Ottomans were learning from failure. They adopted lessons from defeat at Ankara and from years of civil war. Command structures became clearer. Succession rules were enforced more ruthlessly. The state accepted that internal unity was as important as victory on the battlefield. By the middle of the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire had fully recovered from its greatest crisis. It stood once again as the dominant power of southeastern Europe and western Anatolia. Its armies were experienced. Its leaders were hardened by survival. Its institutions were stronger than before. The stage was now set for a transformation that would change world history. A young ruler would soon rise, determined to achieve what generations before him had failed to accomplish. The next war would not be about survival or consolidation. It would be about conquest on a scale never seen before. In the year 1451, a young ruler ascended the Ottoman throne. He was only 19 years old, but he carried an ambition that dwarfed his age. His name was Mehmed II, and from the moment he took power, his purpose was clear. He would capture Constantinople. For more than 1,000 years, the city had stood as the heart of the Byzantine Empire. Its walls were legendary. Its location controlled the passage between Europe and Asia. Every major power in the region understood its importance. To rule Constantinople was to command trade, movement, and prestige. Many had tried to take it. All had failed. Mehmed was determined to succeed where others had fallen short. He understood that traditional methods would not work. Constantinople's defenses had resisted siege after siege. To break them, he needed something new. He turned to gunpowder. Large cannons were commissioned, some capable of firing massive stone balls weighing hundreds of kilograms. These weapons were slow, difficult to move, and dangerous even to their crews, but they represented a revolution in warfare. For the first time, walls that had once been considered invincible could be shattered. Mehmed also prepared carefully in other ways. He strengthened the Ottoman navy to prevent relief by sea. He built a fortress on the European side of the Bosphorus, cutting Constantinople off from northern supplies. Every route was calculated. Every weakness was studied. In April 1453, the siege began. Ottoman forces surrounded the city on land and sea. Inside Constantinople, defenders prepared for what they knew would be their final stand. The Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former self. Its population was small. Its resources were limited. But its will to resist remained strong. The cannons began to fire. Day after day, the walls were struck. Sections collapsed, were repaired, and collapsed again. The defenders fought desperately, repelling assaults and sealing breaches. The sound of artillery echoed constantly, a reminder that a new age of war had arrived. Mehmed adapted relentlessly. When the Byzantine chain blocked Ottoman ships from entering the Golden Horn, he ordered vessels dragged overland on greased logs. Overnight, the Ottoman navy appeared behind the city's defenses. It was a psychological shock that crushed morale. After weeks of fighting, the final assault came on May 29, 1453. Ottoman troops attacked in waves. Irregular forces exhausted the defenders. Elite Janissaries followed, disciplined and relentless. Eventually, a breach was forced. Ottoman soldiers poured into the city. Constantinople fell. The conquest marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and the beginning of a new imperial era. Mehmed entered the city not as a destroyer, but as a ruler. He ordered protections for civilians and restored order. Constantinople became the new Ottoman capital, later known as Istanbul. The fall of the city sent shockwaves across Europe and the Middle East. It symbolized the triumph of gunpowder warfare over medieval defenses. It also announced the arrival of the Ottomans as a world power. But Mehmed did not stop there. He spent the rest of his reign in constant war. He expanded Ottoman control across the Balkans, subdued rival Anatolian states, and launched campaigns against Venice and other Mediterranean powers. Each campaign refined Ottoman military methods. Mehmed reorganized the army, strengthened the Janissaries, and integrated artillery into every major operation. Warfare became centralized, professional, and highly coordinated. The Ottoman military was no longer a frontier force. It was an imperial machine. By the time Mehmed died in 1481, the Ottoman Empire was transformed. It controlled vast territories, commanded major trade routes, and possessed one of the most advanced armies in the world. Warfare was now embedded into the very structure of the state. The conquest of Constantinople was not just a victory. It was a turning point in global history. It marked the transition from medieval warfare to early modern conflict. It also set the stage for an era of expansion that would push Ottoman armies deep into Europe, across the Middle East, and into North Africa. The empire had crossed a threshold. From this point forward, Ottoman warfare would be fought not for survival, but for dominance. After the conquest of Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire entered an era of continuous expansion. Warfare was no longer about proving legitimacy or survival. It was now about control, security, and dominance across 3 continents. The empire stood at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, and every direction presented both opportunity and danger. Following the death of Mehmed II in 1481, the empire experienced a brief pause in outward expansion, but its military foundations remained strong. This pause ended decisively in the early 16th century with the rise of a ruler who would take Ottoman warfare to its greatest heights. His name was Selim I. Selim inherited an empire that was powerful but surrounded by rivals. To the east stood the Safavid Empire, a rising force in Persia that challenged Ottoman authority and promoted a rival religious identity. To the south lay the Mamluk Sultanate, which controlled Egypt, Syria, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. To the west, European powers watched closely, aware that Ottoman strength continued to grow. Selim was ruthless, decisive, and entirely focused on war. He believed that hesitation was weakness and that internal dissent was as dangerous as foreign enemies. Early in his reign, he moved swiftly to secure the eastern frontier. In 1514, Ottoman and Safavid forces met at the Battle of Calderon. Calderon was a decisive moment in military history. The Safavid army relied heavily on cavalry and traditional weapons. The Ottomans brought artillery and disciplined infantry armed with firearms. The battlefield demonstrated the growing gap between armies that embraced gunpowder warfare and those that resisted it. Ottoman firepower shattered the Safavid advance. The victory secured eastern Anatolia and confirmed Ottoman military superiority. Selim did not stop there. Within 2 years, he turned south against the Mamluk Sultanate. The Mamluks were experienced warriors, but they too underestimated the impact of Ottoman firearms and artillery. In rapid campaigns, Ottoman armies defeated Mamluk forces in Syria and Egypt. Cairo fell in 1517. The Mamluk state collapsed. With this conquest, the Ottomans gained control of the eastern Mediterranean, the Red Sea routes, and the Islamic holy cities. Selim assumed the title of Caliph, linking military power with religious authority. Ottoman warfare was now framed not only as imperial expansion, but as guardianship of the Islamic world. When Selim died in 1520, he left behind an empire vastly larger and more powerful than the one he had inherited. His successor, Suleiman the Magnificent, would transform that power into lasting dominance. Suleiman's reign marked the peak of Ottoman warfare. He was a commander, strategist, and administrator. Under his rule, the Ottoman army became one of the most disciplined and effective military forces on earth. Campaigns were meticulously planned. Supply lines were carefully maintained. Siege warfare, artillery coordination, and battlefield command reached new levels of sophistication. Suleiman's first major campaign targeted Hungary, a key buffer between the Ottomans and Central Europe. In 1526, Ottoman and Hungarian forces met at the Battle of Mohacs. The engagement was brief but devastating. Ottoman artillery and cavalry shattered the Hungarian army. King Louis II was killed. Hungary collapsed as an independent power. Mohacs opened the gates of Central Europe. Ottoman forces advanced toward Vienna, the heart of Habsburg power. In 1529, Suleiman laid siege to the city. Although the Ottomans failed to capture Vienna, the campaign demonstrated the empire's ability to project military power deep into Europe. It also marked the beginning of a long and bitter rivalry with the Habsburgs. While land warfare dominated headlines, the Ottomans were also fighting at sea. Control of the Mediterranean was essential for trade, security, and influence. Under commanders like Hayreddin Barbarossa, the Ottoman navy became a dominant force. North African territories were secured. Ottoman fleets challenged Venice, Spain, and other maritime powers. Warfare during Suleiman's reign was constant. Campaigns were launched almost every year. The empire expanded in the Balkans, defended its eastern borders against Safavid counterattacks, and maintained pressure on European rivals. The Janissaries reached their height as a fighting force, supported by artillery units that were among the best in the world. Yet even at its peak, Ottoman warfare required balance. Expansion strained resources. Prolonged campaigns tested logistics. Suleiman understood that not every war needed to end in conquest. Some were fought to maintain pressure, enforce vassalage, or secure borders rather than annex territory outright. By the time Suleiman died in 1566 during a campaign in Hungary, the Ottoman Empire stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the shores of North Africa to the mountains of Persia. Its military reputation was unmatched. Its armies were feared across continents. But beneath the surface, subtle changes were already beginning. Warfare had reached its limits. Enemies were learning Ottoman methods. European states were modernizing their armies. The balance of power was shifting slowly, almost imperceptibly. The age of unstoppable expansion was ending. What followed would be an era defined not by rapid conquest, but by sustained conflict, naval battles, and the long struggle to maintain supremacy in a changing world. By the second half of the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had reached a size that demanded constant war simply to maintain itself. Borders stretched thousands of kilometers. Enemies surrounded the empire on land and sea. Warfare was no longer driven by ambition alone, but by necessity. After the death of Suleiman, the empire passed to Selim II, a ruler very different from his father. Selim did not lead armies in person. Instead, warfare became the responsibility of generals, admirals, and ministers. This shift marked an important change. Ottoman war was becoming institutional rather than personal. The greatest challenge of this era came from Europe, particularly the Habsburg monarchy. The struggle between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs was not a single war, but a continuous series of campaigns, truces, and renewed fighting that lasted for generations. Hungary remained the central battleground. Fortresses were besieged, lost, retaken, and lost again. Warfare here was slow, exhausting, and costly. Ottoman armies still held advantages in organization and experience, but European forces were improving. Firearms became more common. Defensive fortifications were redesigned to resist artillery. Battles became longer and bloodier, with fewer decisive outcomes. At sea, the conflict reached a dramatic turning point. Control of the Mediterranean had long been essential to Ottoman power. The empire depended on sea routes for trade, supply, and communication with its North African provinces. European powers understood this and formed alliances to challenge Ottoman naval dominance. In 1571, a combined Christian fleet met the Ottoman navy at the Battle of Lepanto. The clash was massive, involving hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men. It was one of the largest naval battles in history. The Ottomans were decisively defeated. Much of their fleet was destroyed. The psychological impact was immense. For the first time in generations, Ottoman naval power had been openly broken in battle. Across Europe, Lepanto was celebrated as proof that the Ottomans could be beaten. Yet the strategic outcome was more complex. Within a year, the Ottomans rebuilt their fleet. New ships were launched. Crews were recruited and trained. While Lepanto ended Ottoman dominance at sea, it did not end Ottoman power. The empire remained capable of defending its interests and projecting force. On land, warfare continued without pause. Campaigns against Persia resumed as Safavid forces attempted to reclaim lost territory. These wars were difficult. Terrain was harsh. Supply lines were long. Victories were costly and often temporary. The Ottomans learned that Eastern warfare demanded endurance rather than speed. Meanwhile, internal strains began to surface. The Janissaries, once the elite core of the army, grew politically powerful. They resisted reform, demanded higher pay, and intervened in politics. Discipline weakened. Corruption spread. Warfare became more expensive and less decisive. By the end of the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire was still formidable, but the nature of its wars had changed. Rapid conquests were replaced by grinding conflicts. Victories no longer reshaped continents. Instead, wars were fought to hold ground, preserve influence, and prevent decline. The empire remained at war with Europe, Persia, and rebellious provinces almost continuously. Peace became temporary. Warfare became routine. This constant pressure began to erode the foundations of Ottoman military superiority. The balance of power was shifting. The Ottomans were no longer facing fragmented medieval states. They were now confronting modernizing empires that learned from every conflict. The long struggle to maintain supremacy had begun, and it would define the next centuries of Ottoman warfare. As the 17th century began, the Ottoman Empire found itself locked into a new reality. War no longer brought rapid expansion or decisive victory. Instead, it demanded endurance. Campaigns dragged on for years. Borders shifted only slightly. Every gain was matched by a loss elsewhere. The empire was fighting not to grow, but to avoid retreat. One of the greatest pressures came from prolonged warfare in Europe. The struggle against the Habsburgs evolved into what became known as the Long Turkish War, lasting from 1593 to 1606. It was a conflict defined by sieges, attrition, and exhaustion. Fortresses along the Hungarian frontier changed hands repeatedly. Armies marched, fought, withdrew, and returned again the following year. Ottoman military strength was still considerable, but the advantages that once made victory swift were fading. European armies had adopted firearms, artillery coordination, and disciplined infantry formations similar to those used by the Ottomans. The technological gap had closed. Battles now depended more on logistics, finance, and manpower than on tactical superiority. These long wars placed enormous strain on the Ottoman system. Supplying armies across vast distances became increasingly difficult. Soldiers went unpaid for months. Desertion rose. Provincial governors struggled to collect taxes needed to support campaigns. Warfare, once profitable through conquest, now drained the treasury. Internal rebellion followed. In Anatolia, bands of armed rebels known as Salali revolts erupted repeatedly. These were not ideological movements, but responses to economic hardship, heavy taxation, and military disruption. Ottoman forces were forced to fight on multiple fronts at once, dividing their strength and attention. The Janissaries, long the backbone of Ottoman military power, were changing. Their numbers increased dramatically, but discipline declined. Many Janissaries no longer trained regularly. Some engaged in trade or politics. They resisted modernization, fearing it would weaken their privileges. Warfare suffered as a result. Despite these challenges, the empire remained resilient. Reforms were attempted. Commanders adapted tactics. Fortifications were improved. But the overall trend was clear. Ottoman warfare was becoming reactive rather than dominant. This reality became impossible to ignore in 1683, during the Second Siege of Vienna. Once again, Ottoman armies marched deep into Central Europe. Once again, Vienna stood as the symbolic gateway to the West. But this time, the circumstances were different. The siege dragged on. Supply lines stretched thin. Coordination faltered. European forces, now better organized and united, launched a massive relief army. In September 1683, the Ottomans were decisively defeated outside Vienna. The retreat that followed turned into a rout. The failure at Vienna marked a turning point. For the first time, the Ottomans entered a sustained period of territorial loss. European armies pushed south and east. One fortress after another fell. The empire fought back, but it was fighting from a position of weakness. In 1699, the Treaty of Karlowitz formalized this shift. The Ottomans ceded large territories in Hungary and Central Europe. It was the first major treaty in which the empire accepted significant and permanent loss of land. Ottoman warfare, once synonymous with expansion, was now associated with defense and retreat. The psychological impact was profound. The idea of inevitable Ottoman victory disappeared. European powers no longer feared Ottoman armies as unstoppable. They saw them as rivals that could be defeated through persistence and coordination. Yet even in decline, the Ottoman military did not collapse. It adapted, learned, and survived. The empire still controlled vast lands and millions of people. Its armies remained capable of fighting long wars. But the age of unquestioned supremacy was over. What lay ahead was a century defined by struggle against rising European powers, especially a new and relentless rival to the north. The wars to come would reshape not only Ottoman borders, but the balance of power across Eurasia. As the 18th century began, the Ottoman Empire faced a world that had changed faster than it could adapt. European powers were reorganizing their armies, modernizing their economies, and coordinating diplomacy with warfare. For the Ottomans, war was no longer a seasonal campaign. It had become a permanent condition. The most dangerous challenge now came from the north. Russia, once a distant and fragmented state, had transformed into a centralized empire with a powerful army and navy. Its rulers saw Ottoman territory as the key to expansion toward warm water ports and control of the Black Sea. The first major clashes revealed a troubling pattern. Ottoman forces fought bravely and in large numbers, but Russian armies were better supplied, better coordinated, and increasingly well trained. Battles became contests of endurance rather than shock. Each defeat weakened Ottoman confidence and encouraged further aggression. By the mid-18th century, Russian power reached a new level under Catherine the Great. Her goal was not merely victory in battle, but permanent strategic advantage. Russian armies pushed south through the steppes, challenging Ottoman control of Crimea and the northern Black Sea. The War of 1768 to 1774 was disastrous for the Ottomans. Russian forces defeated Ottoman armies on land and destroyed much of the Ottoman fleet in the Black Sea. The conflict exposed deep weaknesses in Ottoman command, logistics, and naval power. The Treaty of Kukuk-Kaynarka in 1774 marked one of the most humiliating moments in Ottoman military history. The Ottomans lost control over Crimea, which soon fell under Russian influence. Russia gained the right to protect Orthodox Christians within Ottoman territory, giving it a pretext to interfere in Ottoman affairs for decades to come. This treaty did more than redraw borders. It shattered the old balance of power. The Ottomans were no longer the dominant force in the eastern Mediterranean or the Black Sea. They were now reacting to European initiatives rather than setting them. Ottoman leaders understood that change was necessary. Military reform became a priority. New training methods were introduced. European advisors were hired. Modern artillery units were formed. But reform met fierce resistance from traditional elites, especially the Janissaries, who saw modernization as a threat to their status. Wars continued as reform stalled. Each new conflict with Russia or Austria revealed the same problem. The Ottomans could fight, but they could not fight efficiently. Victories were rare and costly. Defeats were frequent and decisive. By the end of the 18th century, Ottoman warfare was defined by crisis management. Campaigns aimed to prevent collapse rather than achieve victory. Fortresses were defended stubbornly. Retreats were organized to preserve what remained. Yet the empire endured. Despite repeated losses, it did not disintegrate. Its institutions bent but did not break. Ottoman soldiers continued to fight on distant fronts, bound by loyalty, tradition, and necessity. The 19th century would bring an even greater challenge. Warfare itself was changing again. Industrialization, nationalism, and global conflict would place demands on the Ottoman Empire that no previous generation had faced. The struggle for survival was entering its final and most difficult phase. By the beginning of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was fighting a battle against time itself. Warfare had entered an industrial age, and the empire struggled to keep pace. European armies were transforming through centralized command, mass conscription, improved artillery, and modern logistics. For the Ottomans, war was no longer a contest of courage or tradition. It was a test of adaptation. The first shock came from France. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt, one of the empire's most important provinces. The campaign exposed the fragility of Ottoman control over distant territories. Although French forces were eventually expelled with British assistance, the message was clear. The empire could no longer defend its lands alone. Throughout the 19th century, nationalist movements erupted across the Balkans. These uprisings were not merely rebellions. They were wars of independence, fueled by European ideas and often supported by foreign powers. Ottoman armies were deployed repeatedly to suppress revolts in Serbia, Greece, and later Bulgaria. Each campaign drained resources and weakened authority. The Greek War of Independence, beginning in 1821, proved especially damaging. Despite brutal fighting and early Ottoman successes, European intervention changed the outcome. At sea, Ottoman and Egyptian fleets were destroyed by European navies. By 1830, Greece emerged as an independent state. It was the first major territory to break away permanently. Ottoman leaders recognized that the old military system could not survive. Reform was no longer optional. In 1826, Sultan Mahmud II took a drastic step. He destroyed the Janissary corps, once the pride of the empire but now a barrier to modernization. The event was violent and decisive. A centuries-old institution was erased to make way for a new army. Reforms followed, but progress was uneven. Training improved. Uniforms changed. Weapons were modernized. Yet deep structural problems remained. The empire lacked the industrial base to sustain prolonged modern warfare. It depended increasingly on foreign loans, advisors, and weapons. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 revealed both weakness and survival. Ottoman forces fought alongside Britain and France against Russia. On their own, the Ottomans would likely have been defeated. With European allies, they managed to resist Russian expansion. The war preserved Ottoman territory, but at the cost of deepening dependence on foreign powers. As the century progressed, wars came faster and closer together. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 was catastrophic. Russian armies advanced deep into Ottoman territory. Ottoman defenses collapsed across the Balkans. Only diplomatic intervention prevented total defeat. The resulting treaties stripped the empire of much of its European land. New states emerged. Borders shrank. Millions of refugees fled south into remaining Ottoman territory. Warfare now carried a social cost that reshaped the empire's population. By the early 20th century, the Ottomans were known as the sick man of Europe. But the empire was not passive. Military schools trained a new generation of officers. Railways improved movement. Modern weapons were adopted where possible. There was a belief that one final effort could reverse decline. That effort would come in the form of total war. The final chapter of Ottoman warfare unfolded in the most destructive conflict the world had yet known. By the early 20th century, the empire stood weakened, but it was not yet defeated. Its leaders believed that one decisive struggle could restore strength, prestige, and territorial security. That belief would draw the empire into the First World War. Before the global war began, the Ottomans suffered a devastating blow in the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. Former provinces united against their former ruler. Ottoman armies, poorly coordinated and outnumbered, collapsed with alarming speed. Nearly all remaining European territory was lost. Centuries of Ottoman presence in the Balkans ended in a matter of months. The shock was profound. Istanbul itself came under threat. Refugees flooded into Anatolia. The empire was humiliated, but the defeats also forced rapid military reassessment. A new generation of officers rose to prominence, men trained in modern tactics and determined to rebuild the army. Among them was Enver Pasha, a charismatic and ambitious figure who soon became one of the most powerful men in the empire. Along with his allies, Enver believed that alignment with a strong European power was essential for survival. Germany appeared to offer the best chance. When the First World War erupted in 1914, the Ottoman Empire entered the conflict on the side of the Central Powers. The decision transformed the empire's long struggle into a fight for existence. Warfare now spanned multiple fronts, stretching Ottoman resources to the breaking point. One of the most famous campaigns of the war unfolded at Gallipoli in 1915. Allied forces sought to force a passage through the Dardanelles, capture Istanbul, and knock the Ottomans out of the war. It was a bold plan, but one that underestimated Ottoman resistance. Ottoman troops, entrenched along rugged terrain, fought with determination and discipline. Poor Allied planning and fierce defense turned the campaign into a costly failure. Gallipoli became a rare and powerful Ottoman victory, restoring morale and proving that the empire could still fight effectively. A young officer emerged as a key defender during the campaign. His leadership, calm under fire, and understanding of modern warfare set him apart. His name was Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Elsewhere, the war was far less successful. In the Caucasus, Enver Pasha launched an ambitious winter offensive against Russia. The campaign ended in disaster. Poor planning, extreme weather, and logistical failure led to massive losses. Entire units froze or starved before reaching the enemy. In the Middle East, Ottoman forces fought British armies advancing from Egypt and Mesopotamia. Initial resistance slowed the advance, but shortages of supplies, internal unrest, and Arab revolts weakened Ottoman control. The long-held provinces of the Arab world slipped away. By 1918, the empire was exhausted. Its armies were depleted. Its economy was shattered. One front after another collapsed. When the armistice was signed, the Ottomans had lost control of nearly all remaining territories outside Anatolia. The war ended not with a final battle, but with surrender and occupation. Allied forces entered Istanbul. The centuries-old Ottoman state stood on the edge of dissolution. Yet even in defeat, the story of warfare was not over. Out of the ruins of empire would emerge a final struggle, one that would end 600 years of Ottoman rule and give birth to something entirely new. The final end of the Ottoman Empire did not come suddenly. It arrived through exhaustion, occupation, and the slow collapse of authority. After the First World War, the empire that had once dominated 3 continents was reduced to its Anatolian core. Foreign troops occupied its capital. Its army was disarmed. Its future was dictated by others. For 6 centuries, the Ottoman state had survived through warfare. It had expanded, defended, retreated, and adapted. Now, for the first time, it could no longer fight as an empire. In Istanbul, the Sultan remained on the throne, but his power was hollow. Decisions were made under foreign supervision. Treaties divided Ottoman lands without Ottoman consent. What remained of the state existed in name only. In Anatolia, however, the story took a different turn. Veterans of the imperial army, hardened by decades of war, refused to accept partition and occupation. These men were not fighting to preserve the old empire. They were fighting to survive as a people. A new conflict began, separate from imperial ambition and foreign conquest. It was a war of resistance, fought with limited resources but unwavering determination. Former Ottoman officers organized militias, secured supply routes, and rebuilt fighting forces from the remnants of defeat. This final struggle ended the Ottoman system completely. In 1922, the Sultanate was abolished. The institution that had once ruled from the Balkans to Arabia was formally dissolved. 600 years of imperial warfare came to an end. What replaced it was not an empire, but a nation-state built from the lessons of collapse. The era of expansion through conquest was over. The era of survival through reform had begun. The Ottoman Empire left behind a legacy shaped almost entirely by war. Its armies pioneered gunpowder warfare, built one of the world's most disciplined military systems, and fought on nearly every major battlefield of Europe and the Middle East. Its soldiers defended borders that shifted constantly, adapting to new technologies and new enemies across centuries. At the same time, its history revealed the limits of military power. Expansion created strength, but also vulnerability. Victory bred overextension. Tradition resisted reform. When warfare changed faster than the state could adapt, decline became inevitable. Yet the empire's endurance remains remarkable. Few states in history survived as long, fought as continuously, or ruled as diverse a population. The Ottomans were defeated not because they lacked courage or skill, but because the world around them transformed beyond recognition. From frontier raiders to imperial conquerors, from cannon-shattered walls to industrial battlefields, the Ottoman Empire fought through every major phase of pre-modern and modern warfare. Its rise reshaped continents. Its fall redrew the map of the modern Middle East. The empire is gone, but its wars still echo in borders, cities, and memories across 3 continents. The story of the Ottomans is not only a story of conquest and defeat. It is the story of how warfare can build an empire, sustain it for centuries, and ultimately bring it to an end.